Well, what I will talk about today is are the results of a research project which was conducted with Hervé Guillaumard and also with Jean-Christophe Bureau from AgroParisTech. And Hervé and Jean-Christophe are experts of the Common Agricultural Policy. That's why we worked on that. But this specific talk was prepared only with Hervé. So what the main purpose of this talk is to show you that taxing pesticides might be a good idea, and especially for answering to Federico, this instrument is a wide scope instrument. That is, if we tax pesticides, we tax pesticides which are used in all sectors, whether it's only in the agricultural sector or in other sectors, and that's one of the main property of taxing schemes in general. But what's important for this talk is to show that the pesticide issue is very specific, and that's why the taxing is calling for in this case. The other point is also important, is to stress out the fact that taxes are only part of an efficient policy. Other instruments should be used to design a very efficient pesticide policy aimed to reduce pesticide, especially in the agricultural sector. And what makes the taxing schemes very unique in this case is that they are complementary to any other instruments which can be used for reducing pesticide use, at least for fostering pesticide use. Of course, the taxes are not very popular, and I will be the bad guy in this journey. And the point is, we need, for example, to address very important issues, which are the farmers' income issues, because taxes are not very popular among farmers, of course, and there are good reasons for that. And one important point of this talk is that we need to address this income issue, and there are ways to address the issue implied by the income losses due to taxes. And that's very important in this case. So as I just talked to you, I will be the bad guy because I will talk about money, about prices, about optimizing profits and so on. But that's very important to understand what is at stake here, okay? Economics is important in this case. Indeed, as reminded by Niklas, many policies aimed to reduce pesticide use have been launched, especially in the EU, for example. And the first one was to make the criteria for the registration of pesticide more restrictive, and it started in 91. National policy were also launched for reducing pesticides. The first one was maybe the Danish policy, which was launched in 1986, which is far away. And EU launched its pesticide package in 2009. And now we have the Green Deal, who decided or who set target and a reduction of 50% of pesticide use in the EU. Problem is, and it was also reminded by Niklas, all those policies have achieved only limited successes. And that's, for example, the case for the Ecofito program in France. And basically, no, there have been no reduction in pesticide use since 15 years. It's often this lack of success of pesticide policies are often explained by past dependency. And that's, of course, that's very important because all crop protection indeed, pesticides have been the main tool for protecting crops for many years, for decades, indeed. And there have been few research regarding other means to protect crops. And this ended up with various lock-ins along value chains and so on. But that's all right. The point is, as economists, we can also have another view on this problem, that maybe the policy were poorly designed. And that's what the point I would like to address here, okay? And when we look at the current European Union strategy regarding the reduction of pesticides, it's focused on two main points. The first point is to try to conceive, to develop and diffuse new means of protecting crops or even of producing crops, okay? And it's mostly focused on research and development issues, and also on the diffusion of information, of the production of knowledge. And the point is that the idea is to produce new, to conceive new means of protecting crops and diffuse them in the agricultural sector. That's very important, but that doesn't appear to be sufficient. And the other pillar of pesticide reduction policies in Europe are subsidy schemes. We try to subsidize the use, for example, the use of pesticide-saving production practices by farmers. We also provide subsidies to firms for arranging new value chains, for designing labels for green products, and so on. The point is, the main perspective of this kind of policy, it can be illustrated using the famous multi-level perspective socio-economic transition figure, which was proposed by Gilles and which was used, for example, yesterday by Bruno Dorin. The idea is of this kind of policy is that innovations emerge locally. They emerge from farmers, from researchers. And the point is, if we set relevant instruments, we can make this local and small-scale innovation emerge in the general regime, okay? And in this case, the idea is to produce small-scale innovation and to try to find ways to make them dominant in the system, okay? And this bottom-up approach is very very popular because it's bottom-up, okay? And the idea also is that it focuses, and it's also its drawback is that it focuses on very site-specific agricultural production practices and value chain. Problem is that we need a more general picture of the problem in this case. And this is why the strategy is questionable. The first one is that success stories are very limited, and we can identify them, but often the success stories which are based on niche market strategies. For example, green labels are still niche markets. And we can also provide markets for example, diversification crops, which allows to reduce the use of pesticides. The problem is that those solutions, because they are based on niches, cannot be expanded or reproduced at will by definition, okay? And the other drawback of the current policy is that they probably focus too much on information and knowledge and issues, because basically they seem to assume that suitably informed farmers, farm managers, and consumers will make the right choices, okay? And the point is that the problem of the issue raised by pesticides are not information issues only. Well, what is downplayed here, what is minimized here, is the role of economic incentives. We will try to understate the economic issues. And for example, when we consider green labels, green products are usually a little bit more expensive than conventional products. And here we have to consider consumers' budget constraints, which can be very important and very tight for example, for poor consumers. And those also those this kind of pesticide policy strategies that basically assumes that pesticide saving innovations will either they exist or they will emerge, and then they will be adopted by farmers. And this is also this then, according to me, this the strategy understates purely economic issues, because when we look at the numbers and when we discuss, for example, with farmers, the problem is the main issue is that pesticides often remain the best options for protecting crops. And that's no surprise. That shouldn't be no surprise because, and especially in Europe, because current crop production practices in the EU, they are both specialized and high yielding. And as reminded by Bruno Dorin yesterday, this kind of production practices call for relatively high crop protection levels because they are susceptible to pest pressures and to disease pressures. And this high level crop protection cannot be, is difficult to achieve without chemical pesticides. And that this point is very important because we have lots of things to change for reducing the need of pesticides in this case. And what is also important, and considering the economic context, is that those kind of practices have been developed within context, economic and regulatory context, that still prevail today. For example, grains are sold at good prices nowadays. And the point is that this calls for the use of high yielding practices. So there is very little reason to change for farmers or for agri-food firms in this case. And what is important is that here we are talking about the overall context, either regulatory or economic conditions, which are very important. And if we want to address the pesticide issue, we need to address also this issue at this general level. Okay, not only at the local level, we need also to address the pesticide issue at the general level. For example, yesterday Xinjiang talked to us about price of fertilizers, which are very important for explaining the use of fertilizers. The same is true for pesticides. So that's why we need to address the problem at the general level. For example, at the European levels, at the scale of the European level. Indeed, we need we need to change the landscape. Okay, the landscape for actors to change their behavior toward crop protection in general. And this is not very popular because this requires to set or to launch a kind of top-down approach. Okay. The other point which is very important is that because pesticide saving practices and alternatives to pesticides are still to be developed to a large extent, we need to think in the long run, or at least in the medium run. And we need to launch a pesticide policy which is progressive, but which needs to be defined today and we need to define a clear foresight for actors in value chain as well for farmers. And this is an opportunity for us to make use of mechanisms which appear to be very powerful. This is what economists call the induced or directed innovation mechanisms. It means that what this says is that, and this can be illustrated once again with a famous figure of Gills and Schott, is that the regulations and market conditions, they tend to favor specific innovations, those that fit the market conditions. For example, if the price of an input is very high, innovations which are devoted to reduce the use of this input will be valuable on the market. Okay, and this kind of that means that the market conditions which are foreseen by actors, they play a very important role in for driving and orienting innovations. This idea is not new. It has been developed, for example, by X in the 30s. That means that there is scope for large-scale, long-run, top-down interventions, and typically at the EU level in our case. Okay. And for example, well, yesterday, Bruno Dorwan talked to us about the Green Revolution in India. In this kind of induced institutional and technological innovations, they were called for explaining how the Green Revolution occurred in India, and this was the work of Ayami and Rutan, who draw the picture on this. So our objective with Alain and also with Jean-Christophe is, how could we adapt the European Union pesticide policy for achieving the pesticide reduction, which are targeting in the Green Deal? Indeed, we take the idea here is to take the place of policymakers. Okay, if we were policymakers, which kind of policy would we try to design for reducing pesticide use in the EU? And of course, because we are economists, we'll focus on economic incentive and so on, and we will use a framework which is used by economists, which is a public economics analytical framework. Then this is a kind of applied theoretical analysis. We try to address a problem using the framework we master in this case. But because we don't want to this exercise to be purely theoretical, we account for at least we account for the constraints which are faced by policymakers. Okay. And here we'll focus on acceptability issues for the instruments we want to use. And we also consider implementation cost of this instrument, because the different instruments which can be used in policies, they can have very different, very various implementation costs. For example, implementing subsidy schemes can be very expensive, especially if controls have to be implemented at the farm scale. And so considering those costs are very important. And as you will see, our propositions, they will appear relatively disruptive. But what's also important, I think that the challenge we face is so important, we may need disruptive approaches to address it. But what is also important is that our propositions are not only purely theoretical, because they have been used somehow in the past, especially in the CAP. And our main assumption here is that economic agents respond to economic incentives. Okay. Of course, economics and economic motives are not the only ones that drive actors' choices and behavior. The point is that even if they are not the only ones, they are very important, especially for firms and farms, which are specifically designed for making money one way or another. Okay. And to show you that economic matters, economic issues matters, I will just present you a small figure and small numbers. This kind of a spoiler, because this result have not been published yet, but this figure shows you the net return of fungicide use on wheat in France, on average from 2003 to 2021. The red line shows you the expected return for the first spray of fungicide, the net return of first spray of fungicide. It means that, and this return runs from 50 euros per hectare till up to 200 euros per hectare. That's a lot on average, and depending on the conditions, it can go up to 400 euros. That means that Fungicide use is the stake of using, the stake here is very important, okay? And so the red line shows you the net return of the second spray of fungicides, okay? It's a little bit positive, it's around 0, but it means that it's profitable for farmers, okay? And the typical fungicide protection program of French farmers is about 2 sprays. It's around 2 sprays. That means that farmers are economically rational, very rational, because they use fungicides close to their expected profit maximizing level. Okay. Also, what is important to consider when we consider chemical crop protection is that we can pesticide saving production practices have been designed, proposed by researchers. For example, here we can consider the low input weed management practices proposed by Ménard. They were especially proposed for reducing fungicides, the use of fungicide, and you can reduce the use of fungicide by basically 50%, but problem is that this kind of practices, they entail yield losses around 5 to 10%. Say, that's not a lot, reduction of the yield level by 5 to 10%. The problem is that given the current wheat prices, it's not worth to adopt such kind of practices, because reducing yields by 10%, it's worth about 150 euros. Whereas if you skip one fungicide spray, you will only save 30 euros or 40 euros. Okay, so that's not profitable to reduce pesticide use in this case. And this is a typical problem, is that often pesticide saving production practices and alternatives to pesticides are not as profitable as their conventional counterparts. And this shouldn't be a surprise. But this doesn't mean that agronomists do a poor job when designing alternative practices. And this is very important, because when we talk about economic issues with our colleagues who are agronomists, are often upset about this. The problem is that by design, chemical input saving production practices, they are put at a disadvantage. We need to consider that agrochemicals are easy to use, are technically efficient, and relatively inexpensive. We have seen that with fungicides. When compared to what they bring to farmers from an economic viewpoint, fungicides are relatively cheap. And in this case, when conventional production practices are designed, they can rely freely on any amount of agrochemicals. When agronomists design pesticide saving practices or agrochemical saving practices, indeed they set more or less implicitly bounds on the use of agrochemicals. But because these agrochemicals are cheap and efficient, there shouldn't be there is no surprise. The constrained practices are usually less profitable than the unconstrained practices. Okay, that's important. And moreover, when you consider the world picture, organizations and technologies have co-evolved for decades. That means that they are efficient and coherent because they have been optimized for decades. And that explains the past dependency issues, which are very important. So, where are we now? Well, we know that if we want to reduce pesticide use, that will entail significant costs. And there are two kinds of costs. There are investment costs, the ones you need to incur for conceiving, developing, and diffusing new production practices or alternatives to pesticides. And the other costs are the fact that, at least in the short run, the practices and alternatives to pesticides will be a bit less profitable than pesticides on the one hand and current production practices on the other hand. But that's true given the current economic and regulatory context. The point is that the context can be changed. Okay, it can be changed. And that will be the word point later in the talk. But what is important is that, of course, because reducing pesticides entails cost, policymakers are reluctant to address these issues. But the problem is that simply waiting for silver bullets to emerge is simply a waste of time. Okay, that simply consists of postponing indefinitely the intended reduction in agrochemicals. Okay, and that also means that because we need to consider a wide variety of approaches for reducing pesticide use, because the less constrained we are in our searching for solutions, the least will be the cost to reduce pesticide use in our case. The cost of reducing pesticides, they are to be borne by our societies. They can be paid by farmers, agri-food firms, consumers, taxpayers. It can be shared. And the point is, what is important is that the way the policy is designed defines the way the cost is shared among agents. Depending on the instruments we include in the policy, the cost will be borne mostly by some agents or others. Okay, and that's a point we need to address because it entails acceptability and fairness issues. Okay, but another point which is important when designing policy is that we need this policy to be efficient. Even if it relies on instruments which are not very popular, it needs to be efficient, because inefficient policies cost twice. They entail waste of public money first, and then sometimes they do not allow you to enable you to achieve the intended objectives, which can be important. So now, how could we modify the common agricultural policy for achieving the objective of the Green Deal?
Alain, excuse me, you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. We need to, indeed, it's useful to distinguish two types of instruments when considering the regulation of pollution. There are forcing instruments, which are imposed. For example, these instruments are imposed. They are imposed to drive changes in actors' choices. Those are command and control instruments, for example, standards and norms and quotas, or you have price incentives, especially taxes in our case. But there are also facilitating instruments, which are proposed to farmers or to actors for easing their choices. And this includes subsidy schemes or support to research and development, which provide actors with new means of addressing the issues they face. Both types of instruments are complementary, because facilitating instruments, they enhance the effectiveness of forcing instruments. But what is important is that facilitating instruments are of little use without forcing instruments in this case. And when we observe the current and planned CAP, we can see that it includes many facilitating instruments. Indeed, it includes many subsidy schemes, which are very, well, indeed, you can get subsidies for many things within the CAP. But the point is that when considering the issue of reducing pesticide use, is that the common agricultural policy likes suitable forcing instruments. Okay, and when considering the use of incentive instruments, there are three main types of instruments which are considered by economists. The first one are subsidy schemes, which are, as I said, facilitating. The problem is that they are often used, and they are often used because they seemingly kill several birds with one stone. The incentive, they can provide incentive for adopting the practices, they are facilitating, and they, maybe more importantly from policymakers, they don't hurt farmers' income. Okay. Otherwise, you can use command and control instruments. For example, standards on the properties of pesticides or non-treated areas are example of command and control instruments. Or you can also use incentive taxes. Incentive taxes are high rate taxes because they are intended to reduce pollution and, in our case, the use of pesticides. Okay. There is only one case of incentive tax on pesticides, which is in Denmark. Other taxes on pesticides, they are implemented for raising funds. They are not implementing for orienting or for reducing pesticide use because their rate is too low. The problem is that the subsidy schemes which are used in the common agricultural policies are poorly suited as large-scale policy instruments because they are prescriptive. And this is the problem with the issue of pesticide is that the alternatives to pesticide and pesticide-saving practices are very diverse. They are very complex. They are adaptive. They are site-specific, and so that's difficult to design a subsidy scheme for each relevant case, or that would be very costly, prohibitively costly. And also, the incentive properties of subsidy schemes or standards are limited because there is no incentive to go beyond what is required either by the scheme or by the standard. That means once you have achieved what is required by the scheme, there is no reason to go further. And also, when considering command and control instruments, it's important to recognize that bans can be very costly for farmers. This explains why they are difficult to implement for policymakers. And when they are implemented, they are farmers, for example, are granted with numerous exemptions. We have examples with neonicotinoids in Europe currently. And the last instrument, the last resort we have are incentive taxes in this case. And indeed, when considering the issue of pesticides, they have very appealing properties. Their implementation is relatively cheap. They are adaptable because we can adapt tax rates to the properties of the pesticide, and we can also adapt the rates over time. And they have strong incentive properties because they put economic pressure on any unit of pesticide use. And that's important because the other properties of this instrument derive for these incentive properties. And there are also wide scope incentives because indeed farmers can decide how they adapt to the tax. And it means that taxes, they stimulate the demand from farmers for any means to reduce pesticide use, whether it is agronomic or it is purely technological. That also implies, that also explains why taxes are complementary to any other policy instruments. Indeed, raising the price of pesticide would enhance the efficiency of any other instrument intended to reduce pesticide use. Okay. And they can induce strong, they can activate innovation in the medium and long run. Indeed, the fact that, for example, if innovators know that the price of pesticide will be high in the future, they know that if they are able to conceive relevant means to reduce pesticide use, there will be a demand from farmers for this kind of innovations. Okay, and in passing,
sorry, you will have to conclude. I'm sorry to rush.
Okay, I'll just conclude. And in passing, just to a point, and just to conclude, of course, the main drawback of the tax is that it entails significant losses for farmers, especially if the rate is high. And this is a major issue because if you choose low tax rate, they are useless. Those taxes are useless. But if you consider high tax rates, they are unacceptable for farmers, and rightfully they are unacceptable for farmers. But high rate taxes are necessary. So we need to find a way to go around this problem. And the idea here is to compensate farmers' losses, and it's possible. And unfortunately, I will try to present a relevant compensation scheme in this case. And compensating farmers for them paying a tax is not unfair because they are asked to reduce their pesticide use to the benefit of all. Okay, and that also recalls that taxing pesticides. We want to tax the use of pesticides. We don't want to tax the users of pesticides because we don't want to punish farmers because they lawfully use pesticides, and we don't want to raise money by raising taxes because incentive taxes basically they kill their base because if you increase the tax rate, you will reduce pesticide use, so you won't get any money. And just to finish, returning the tax revenue to the tax sector one way or another is increasingly considered for acceptability and fairness purpose, which is very important in our case. And that's possible when considering pesticide taxes. And sorry for my being too slow in the beginning of the talk.
Thank you so much, Alain, for this nice presentation and these useful insights. I have to discuss your presentation, and we are a little bit late, so I will try to be short to leave some time for if there are any questions. Yeah, I understand your point of view of defending taxes as the best solution, but it is still not the best one from the economic point of view, as it is only the second best, because we are not taxing the pollution, we are taxing the input which is responsible of pollution, different kind of pollution, which is very complicated to tax the pollution itself. So this is my first point. My second one, okay, if we accept that we are going to put taxes for pesticide in Europe, for the Green Deal, for example, or the CAP, according to you, what is the best level of tax to have? How are you going to calculate it? You are economist, but you could maybe have an idea on what is the best way to have this, to make it more acceptable, to tell people, so we are putting this level to compensate your loss or to compensate any other thing you can think about. So this is my second point. The last one is at which spatial level you could have this tax. Are you thinking about to have tax at the level of the EU, or to have different taxes at national scale, or even we could think about something more local, regionally, in places where, for example, Federico showed us this morning, in specific places where we have a lot of pollution or a lot of externalities from this pesticide use. Thank you very much, Alain. If you could have very short answers, it would be good. Thank you.
Yeah. In the case of pesticide, as shown, for example, by Federico, is addressing the pollution due to pesticides is very difficult because the way pesticide degrade in the environment can be very heterogeneous. So, of course, it's a shortcut is just to address the pesticide issue by reducing the uses of pesticide and not necessarily reducing the pollutions due to pesticide, even if there are some instruments can be used for limiting, for example, the transfers of pesticides into the environment and limiting the presence of residues in food. So your second question was about the tax rate. What is a good, the relevant rate of the tax? I would say that the relevant rate of the tax is the one which allows you to achieve the 50% reduction, which is intended in the Green Deal. The point is that it can be very high. Our simulations tend to show that it goes up to 100% of the price of pesticides. The point is that if you combine the tax scheme with a suitable compensation scheme, the tax rate is not so important because you neutralize, if you are able to neutralize the income effect of the tax on farmers' income, whatever the tax rate is not really an issue. It's not really an issue for acceptability purposes. And the main problem we need to address when implementing a tax is neutralizing the income effect. And if you have designed a suitable compensation scheme, the tax rate it can be very high, because if you just have to transfer money in this case to return the money to the farmer, but you need to preserve the incentive effect of the tax. And when considering the scale of the tax, it should be uniform at the EU scale, because indeed that's a legal constraint, indeed, but that's also a relevant constraint. The point is that the compensation scheme can be made more local for addressing the heterogeneity of conditions across the EU, and that's possible.
Thank you very much, Alain, for these answers. And so we have 5 minutes left to have small questions and very, very short answers. So we have Federico and maybe Thierry. Federico, yeah, please.
Yes, I in reality have a very wide question, but I try to phrase it very quickly. So I have in mind the paper by Robert Finger, No Switzerland Pesticide Free, but let's assume that it's going to be pesticide free. And the question is for everyone, but in particular Alain and maybe Nicholas. Let's assume Switzerland is pesticide free, but let's assume that this white t-shirt is produced with cotton in Turkey, is manufactured in Bangladesh, and is sold in Switzerland. Cotton requires a lot of pesticides. So now you know where I want to go. What is the ethics? I mean, at what level enters the ethics in the interconnected economies nowadays, where a country can decide to become pesticide free or reduce the impact, when, however, the goods that it imports are coming from production systems that still imply a lot of pesticide use. So there must be, in my point of view, some common shared attitude to pesticide policy design that implies a little bit of ethics when it comes to the cross-country and trading of goods. And this, of course, is a very wide question, but I think actually we have to start reasoning in these terms, not just the local authority or the local government.
Yeah, I can provide element of answers to this question. That was in my conclusion. The point is that if you want to regulate the use of pesticides in a country, there will be market issues, and especially international trade issues, and then also need to be addressed. And it also entails ethic issues. For example, the issue you mentioned are the leakage issues, the so-called leakage issues, and they have to be addressed by combining what you do, the policy you implement within your countries with relevant trade issues, with relevant trade policy. In this case, that's possible. That's not easy, but that's possible.
No, I know it's a very wide question, so I understand it's impossible to answer here, but I just wanted to raise this thinking that we may reason at the wider scale in my point of view. So very appreciated, Alain. Thanks.
I think that Patrice had a question. It was related to this one. It was about trade. Patrice, you could maybe...
But Alain already answered
the question. Perfect.
If I just add the comment, I talked about one option, which is the border, the complementary border adjustment taxes. I guess it's among the option that Alain could, that was included in Alain's response, but it's just a comment.
Yeah, that, for example, that's a relevant issue when considering carbon taxes within the EU, and that's currently on the agenda in the European Union negotiation for policy.
And to complete, I think the points raised by Federico, it will be, I think it will be considered in the talk of Jutta, the last talk. It's also concerning consumers. You could also have policies which take into account the consumer's point of view, and which could maybe answer what you're talking about on iLook and the consumption that you will have from abroad. So thank you.